Thank you so much. So my name is Dekel. I am the CEO of FDNA, startup in the field of AI and healthcare, where we kind of like to think about ourselves as a startup in the intersection between AI, genomics, precision medicine, and healthcare. I was really flattered to be invited here to talk about successful or accomplished entrepreneurship from Israel, but a little bit confused because, as you said, I presented a lot of times as many times as a lawyer. I'm definitely not an accomplished entrepreneur. I am a beginner, if anything. But then again, when I started thinking about what I can tell you, it occurred to me that many times people that are considering being an entrepreneur know about the successful entrepreneurs. They try to learn what brought their success, to reverse engineer that into a recipe of success. So I thought I'd tell you a story about the hardships, the challenges, the difficulties of entrepreneurship. And in healthcare, there are many of those. I'll share my story as it evolves through the story of my company, FDNA, as it evolves through this entire industry of healthcare and specifically AI in healthcare, what we like to refer to sometimes as healthcare 2.0. And it's very different than the traditional healthcare stories that you hear. Hopefully, if any of you are considering a career as an entrepreneur, this will strike a chord and maybe help you. So this is me 15 years ago. I started off as a lawyer. I went through all the milestones that are required from a corporate attorney. I did a couple of years at Skadden Arps in the corporate finance group of Skadden Arps in New York. I came back to Israel to work for a law firm. I was on my path to become a partner until I felt like this is not for me anymore. I started envying my clients. I would represent startupists, entrepreneurs, and I would look at the excitement in their eyes. I would look at people that are making business decisions, and I always aspired to make business decisions. I was the kind of lawyer that would say, here's the legal aspect, but can I contribute to the business aspect? And I felt confined by the restrictions of the legal framework. In my view, the legal framework is a platform to do business. Nothing more than that. So I did what any successful lawyer that wants to go out of business does. I went to business school, like many of you here. And I was starting to think about the next career move. What would it be? Consulting, banking, middle management for large corporations. Never in a million years have I thought that I'm going to go into a startup. Then one day, a classmate of mine introduced me to two entrepreneurs. One, Moti Schneiberg, was in his mid-40s, no formal education, a brilliant man from his 20s, does one startup after another. You can't sit with this person for 5 minutes without a new idea coming up. And his partner, a professor from the Tel Aviv University, did his postdoctorate here around the corner in MIT. One of the leading figures in Israel in computer vision, machine learning. Did I say brilliant? That's probably an understatement. I still don't understand 50% of what he says. And it turns out that these guys were behind the technology that Facebook uses to tag images. So they came with a lot of experience in facial recognition. I was deeply impressed until they came to me with this crazy idea, said, we want to use facial photos to predict health issues with people. And I said, okay. And even more surprising than that, they offered me a job. And I thought, what can I contribute to this? But given their very unique, I would say, characteristics, I thought maybe I can add structure here. That's something that I know how to do. I can add structure, I can add diligence, I can do a lot of the legwork. And I took the offer. I did some digging, right? That's something that lawyers love to do. I did some digging. I wanted to see if there's science behind this. And it turns out that in genetics, and this is something that I had no idea, there's a very high correlation between facial patterns and specific diseases. You all know this. When you look at Down syndrome patients, there's a pattern, there's a signature. There's a look about them that you just recognize immediately. Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to why you recognize that immediately. And I started digging in more. I just wanted to understand more. And so apparently this is not just for Down syndrome. This is for thousands of genetic disorders that affect somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population. You hear the word rare disease and you think, okay, well, we're never going to hear about a patient with this disease. But when you aggregate them as a group, it's not rare at all. Sometimes we call that the Rarity Paradox, right? But with thousands of diseases, they impact a pretty large percentage of the population. Worse than that, they impact kids. So most of these genetic disorders are inborn errors, and kids have debilitating problems, chronic conditions. They have high morbidity and mortality rates. And in addition to all that, it's very hard to diagnose them. So on average, a rare disease patient in the US could wait 7 years for a diagnosis because of lack of awareness, difficulty to tie these underlying symptoms into a genetic disorder, understanding what to do with it. So hearing all that, learning all that, I was hooked. So I just decided this is going to be what I'm going to do for the next few years of my life. And I just jumped ship from my law firm. I became CEO of FDNA, and for the next 6 months, I was CEO and the only employee of the company. So no more corner office with the view of the Empire State Building. I had an office with no windows, and I had to excuse myself to all my ex-colleagues of, I'm CEO, but I don't have any employees. But hey, at least I was CEO, right? Got what I wanted. My task was to build a product that took facial photos of patients, uses AI, and in real time can help physicians get a genetic diagnosis. Sounds impossible, right? How do I do this? I had to get money. To get money, funding, that's an issue. To get money, you have to have a very compelling business case. I'm starting to get kind of a sense of the challenges for entrepreneurs. I have to start getting a sense of, what's the market need here? What's the problem? What's the product plan? What's the business model? Customer segmentation. A lot of things that kind of blow my mind. I don't have any background in engineering. I don't know how to build a product. I don't have any medical or biological or scientific background. How will I deal with all this? And my business background was very limited. So I did what I know how to do, which is due diligence. I started learning. I started doing my research. I read a lot online. I started reading publications. I met with experts. I traveled to conferences. I talked to industry stakeholders. And everywhere I went, everyone I met told me one thing: you're in the wrong business. There's nothing to do with this type of technology. We are now in the genome sequencing era. In 5 years from now, that was in 2011, 5 years from now, we're going to see a genome sequence with $100 per sequence, and we're just going to know the answer. No one needs this technology. They were absolutely right, except for one part. But genome sequencing has decreased in price in a rate that is just unbelievable. And you're just seeing the 2011 figures here. We're now down to $1,000 per sequence. This is unbelievable, right? A little bit later than expected and not $100, but we're going to get there. And if we get there, why would we need our technology? So I started digging, and what the only thing that wasn't discussed is what do we do with all the data that we get from the genome sequence? Now again, I'm learning as I move, and what I figured is that once you sequence a person's genome, you basically get enough data to fill up dozens of very thick books filled with ACGT letters as a sequence, and now you have to take all this information and make sense out of it. Now that is the big problem, even today, with genomics. What do you do with all the data? Even with the diseases that we are currently treating, the monogenic disorders, diseases that are caused by a single mutation, where we know most of these genes and most of these variations that are causing the disease, the problem is that the diagnostic yield, our ability to diagnose patients, is limited to about 40% of those cases. So not really a very good diagnostic scheme. So as I started to understand this field a little bit more, I started asking, so how do we diagnose? How do we use this genomic data? Yes, there are some statistical models that we can use to reduce the noise and get into those genetic differences, the genetic variations that are causing diseases. But the real answer is phenotyping. Remember, I have no medical background. Phenotyping, what the heck is phenotyping? I don't know what phenotyping is. Phenotyping is basically annotating, observing clinical signs by physicians. So if you look at a person's face and you detect a pattern, that's phenotyping. Bingo, we have a business model. We have a market need. Now I know what needs to be done with our technology. And basically, we've created a story, we've created projections, we've created a product plan. Now all we need is money. Now, I'm not going to take you through this entire grueling process of fundraising. I will say it's a lot like dating, but without the fun parts. And over the lifetime of the company, this is something that you do all the time. So as my role as CEO, I would say 50% of it is to go out and seek money. Over the lifetime of our company, we've raised about $35 million. So we're pretty well funded. And most of our funding comes from, I would say, wealthy individuals and strategic investors rather than venture capitalists, although we do fit the model for venture capital. But now comes the real challenge. So we have a story, we have a plan, we have money. And what would be the biggest hurdle for an AI company? Anyone here? Data. How do we get the data? I mean, pharma companies with billions of dollars are looking for these patients, rare disease patients, and they can't find them. How can we find these patients? How do we get the data to train AI? That was an insurmountable challenge for us. And so we did what Israeli entrepreneurs do. We went and started the guerrilla warfare, right? We scanned the internet. We scanned through all the medical literature to harvest any information that we can. We knocked on doors and tried to collaborate with researchers that we found through these medical literature and publications. And gradually, step by step, we got enough data to start training an algorithm that can produce barely, sufficient results that could be presented at conferences. But one collaboration led to another, and at some point we felt like we have something that could be enough to start. And that was 3 years into the game. These were the early days of iPhone, cloud computing, gig economy. One of our engineers came to me and said, why can't we just develop an iPhone app and pay physicians to upload photos of patients and annotate them? We'll get all the data in the world, and they get a few bucks. What do they care? Now, obviously, if you know anything about doctors, that's not going to fly. But there was a point there behind that very naive statement. The point was, this data all resides in silos of data. Thousands of silos of data around the world. What if we could connect all these silos of data through some sort of value and get all that information? Then we could actually go and start developing technology. So the idea was to create a virtuous cycle of value whereby we develop something, it's used by physicians, they contribute data through that network, we take that data, we develop technology, we roll out back that technology to the users, we get more users, more data, better technology, and on and on. Great idea, by the way. Now, we started focusing on the product. And again, I don't know how many of you have tried to put a product in doctors' hands, but the one thing you don't do is what companies in Silicon Valley are doing. You do not disrupt anything. You do not mess with their workflow. You learn their workflow, and then you try to add incremental value. And you need adoption, because if doctors don't feel like you're trying to do the right thing, then you're done. So workflow is king. And so we've spent our time studying how physicians work, how geneticists, our target audience, works. And we've spent a lot of time, I don't know, for some reason, all the genetic departments are located in the basement of the hospital. So we've spent hours and hours in the basement of hospitals studying geneticists. And don't get me wrong, geneticists are probably the most wonderful group of physicians that you're ever going to meet. They're underpaid, they're overworked, and all they care about is finding the answers for their patients. And they're extremely collaborative. But so we spend the time with them, and then at some point we decided now is the time. It was March 2014. We didn't have a lot of funding back then. We were bootstrapping. And we gathered what would be a pretty big amount for us, and we took a booth, a 10 by 10 booth, at the American College of Medical Genetics Conference in Nashville, Tennessee. And we decided to launch our iPhone app called Face to Gene. We launched it, and in 3 days, we got 300 users, and people just stood in line to see demos of our product. We would stand in the hallway showing it to 4 or 5 doctors at a time. We wouldn't sit for 3 days, and this was one of the most exciting times of my life. Understanding that there's a product market fit, just feeling that you nailed it for an entrepreneur is just, I can't describe that feeling. And then we stepped into the next phase of our life, right? Maturity. Growing pains, and there are a lot of growing pains. You start answering really hard questions. What about patient privacy? What about compliance with regulatory issues? What about stability, reliability? How do we support more than 2 users uploading a photo at once and not having the system crash? These are a lot of things that we've spent a lot of our growing pains handling. Today, I'm really happy to say that Face to Gene is the leading phenotyping applications in the clinical genomics world. We're being used by more than 70% of the clinical geneticists around the world. We're operated in more than 2,000 hospitals in over 130 countries. So big checkbox on the product side in the virtuous cycle, but this had also proven very useful in producing data. To date, we've been able to process more than 150,000 patients around the world. Every single month, we're getting over 5,000 patients in the system, and these are rare disease patients. Our system already holds information for over 10,000 different disorders. About a quarter of them we've already identified a very unique facial pattern about them. And the data itself has also proven to be very useful with technology. This technology that we're calling Deep Gestalt was published 2 months ago in Nature Medicine. We've shown that for about 300 different disorders, we can get accuracy levels of above 90% in identifying the right phenotype. And it looks very, very promising. Now, the next phase for us in the next publication that we're working on is how to combine this phenotyping technology driven by AI with genomics. Early studies, and again, this is pending publication, but we've been able to show that when we combine genome sequencing for these disorders that manifest in the face with our Deep Gestalt model, we've been able to improve the diagnostic yield from 40% to 98%. So we have created, in my opinion, a new standard of health in this world. We've revolutionized the world of phenotyping. We've disrupted, even though we didn't try to disrupt, we've disrupted the workflow of a clinician and this world. But as we've succeeded with these missions, our appetite grew. And so now we understand that phenotypic data, which is by all means not limited to facial information, is crucial in understanding the genome and utilizing it for diagnosis. So our appetite grew, and now we're thinking, what if we can use video to assess movement disorders? What if we can use medical imaging to tie bone structure and MRI images to genetic disorders? What if we can tap into voice and vital signs? What if we can take all this phenotypic information together with the clinical notes and the abundance of information that hides there, combine it with the genome? And that's where we're going. And through all this story, I haven't talked once about how we make money. Making money is so hard in this field, right? Selling to hospitals, selling to payers, or getting reimbursed, nightmare. So we've decided that as a company, we'll first get to be a standard. We'll first get to have the biggest, the largest and fastest growing database in the world. And we'll essentially own this domain. And now we're at a stage of commercialization, which is challenging. We have to find new business models. And we've identified several places where we can add tremendous value to stakeholders in genomics. Obviously, hospitals, very challenging to get money, but we can help them diagnose patients. We can help them reorganize the phenotypic data for research. With genetic testing labs, with interpretation companies, we can help them increase the diagnostic yield. So we're working with several partners in this field to improve that process, to utilize genome sequencing as a diagnostic tool. With research and development of drugs, one of the major issues is clinical trials, and in rare diseases, recruiting patients for clinical trials. How do you do that? How do you find patients? So we're working with CROs, contract research organizations, to help them improve the process, help them find patients. With pharma companies, it's even more acute. Once you have a drug on the market, how do you find patients in the real world? So screening programs and a lot of different ideas that we're working with different stakeholders. This is something that's happening right now. So we're still, I'm not an accomplished entrepreneur until I figure out the business model and we crack that and we're a huge success. But as I kind of went through the challenges of our company, and I talk about these challenges all the time, and I meet entrepreneurs in this world of AI and healthcare, I understood that we're not alone. Everyone goes through these challenges. So I want to talk a little bit about the industry and the challenges that everyone faces, and I think are going to occupy our time in the next, I would say, probably 5 years. But to do that, I want to go back and maybe define what AI means, artificial intelligence. Okay, so I have a definition that I like to use, and I'd like to see if this resonates, right? So artificial intelligence, any device that perceives its environment, takes action that maximizes the chance of successfully achieving a goal. And so if we think about what is currently defined as AI, I think that this doesn't really describe a lot of what's out there. Actually, I've read a recent report that says that nearly half of the companies that are classified as AI don't even use AI. So AI has become this buzzword that companies are now almost embarrassed if they don't use AI in their pitch deck, right? But when you talk about AI, we can roughly define AI as, or classify that into two groups. The general, the strong AI, right? The cognitive abilities of computers to perceive their environment. That, in my opinion, doesn't exist, and we're decades away from something really strong AI. On the other side of the spectrum, there's narrow AI, and almost everything in AI today is narrow AI. So these are tasks that are very specific that computers use techniques like machine learning or computer vision to accomplish. Facial recognition is a narrow AI. Natural language processing, narrow AI. We ask the computer to do something, usually pattern recognition within sets of big data. And computers are great in doing that, much better than humans, right? I cannot see a human being competing with a computer on these type of tasks, especially if the data is really, really big. So, do we even need humans anymore? I mean, there are a lot of concerns when we're talking about AI. There are a lot of concerns. Some are tangible, some are justified, some exaggerated, right? I'm much more concerned that my autonomous car is going to crash than I am about the demise of humanity from an army of robots. But this begs the question, what is the role of AI? What's the role of a human being, especially in healthcare? And I think we have to be very vigilant and very prudent on how we apply AI in healthcare. At the end of the day, people's lives are at stake. So I want to talk about a couple of issues. The first question is, will AI replace human beings? And the question, or will it replace doctors? And to answer that, I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite activities and my privileges as a CEO is going to our users and interviewing them and talking to them, asking them, how are you using our products? How do you think our products work? Because no one knows how our product works, but it's fun to hear the answers. My favorite answer, my favorite feedback on how doctors use our product is, it got me thinking about something that would never occur to me, and at the end of the day, that started the diagnostic process, and that's how I diagnose my patient. Because that's exactly how we intend for our AI, our products to work. We don't want the AI to decide. We want the AI to augment. We want the doctors to be empowered. We want to present to them insights and information in an accessible way for them to make decisions. They've went to medical school. They have experience of years to exercise their cognitive skills, right? The machine cannot replace that. The machine can store a lot of information and retrieve information very quickly. And so, to answer the question, will AI replace doctors? No. But doctors who use AI are going to replace doctors who don't. Now, I think to illustrate that point, maybe one of the questions that I want to use or ask you guys, because you all use AI, is how many of you, when you put in an address in a GPS, follow the instructions without any thinking or without questioning the GPS, just by a raise of hand? I would say about half. Okay. You might want to rethink that when you understand how AI works. And so it is our responsibility as developers of AI to educate our consumers on what are the capabilities and what are the limitations. We need to show them especially doctors, by the way. They always want to know, so how does it work? And with deep learning, it's a little bit difficult to explain. Second question or second issue that I think is going to be on our mind for the next few years is AI for everyone, or is it for both the rich and the poor, or just the rich, right? There's a lot of inequity that we're dealing with, especially in genomics. But AI is notoriously known for having biases and prejudice. And basically, if you think about this, if you think about our skill set is the sum of our experiences. And with AI, it's only as good as the data that it holds, right? So we need to be very, very careful with what data we're feeding AI. If we feed it the wrong kind of data, there's going to be biases in the product itself, in the technology itself. In genomics, this is a very well-known problem. Most of the genomic data in the world is based on European descendants. It's not something that I've invented. This is what, I think this probably applies to a lot of healthcare fields. But in genomics, that's really because of the recent history of being so expensive, this was only done with rich countries. And so when we think about this, especially in genomics, inheritance and ethnicity has a lot of influence, and genomics is different between different people. So this is something that we must address in the next few years. I'm happy to say that, for FDNA, we've actually been ahead of that curve because we've made our technology free of charge for providers. We are working across the world in over 130 countries. So in our database, less than 50% of the data is attributed to European descendants. It doesn't reflect the composition of the world population yet, but it's still better than what we have in other areas. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to. Now, I'm not just saying this because this is the right thing to do, but when it comes to AI, it's actually the better way to develop AI. The more diverse the data is, the more robust the model is. So we've actually looked and compared models that we had just looking at specific ethnicities versus diverse ethnicities. They always perform better when we have a diverse ethnicity range. Now, third and last problem that we're going to talk about, and I think is going to be something that everyone is talking about, is privacy, patient privacy. Now, I already said AI requires data. The data is in silos. We have to share data. How can we share data and keep patient privacy at the same time? Especially when we're talking about facial photos of patients that are by definition personal health identifiers, right? And so this is a conflict that we're always trying to kind of balance. We need to share the data to get more insights to develop more robust AI. How do we do that by while still protecting patient information? Everyone is dealing with that. We're seeing several technological advancements that might help with that. Some are related to blockchain technology, some to de-identification of information. We're seeing policy influencing this in terms of dynamic consent and patients actually controlling where their information is going, and a lot of direct-to-consumer. People or companies are trying to bypass the gatekeepers, the healthcare providers that are subject to a lot of liability, and saying, let the patient decide what to do with their information. So, to conclude my talk, I want to go back to what really drives and is in common for all entrepreneurships, right? All entrepreneurs is about the mission. It's about the passion. When we look at this picture, what we see here is a 4-year-old patient, Keegan, who's been diagnosed by Dr. Karen Grip, who's our Chief Medical Officer, with a syndrome called Smith-Lemli-Opitz. It's a rare disease. The prevalence is somewhere between 1 in 20,000 and 1 in 60,000. Disease manifests with autism, developmental delays, malformations with the heart, the lungs, the gastrointestines, and there's a need for a lot of interventions throughout the life of patients with this syndrome. The earlier you can diagnose, the better you can be in prescribing the management plan. So Keegan and tens of thousands of other patients have already been diagnosed, or we help diagnose these conditions. And looking back at all these hardships, thinking that this has all been done partially because of a decision I made 8 years ago, I have no regrets, and I recommend that everyone follow their passion and become an entrepreneur.
Thank you for that brilliant talk and really unnecessarily modest Dekel. What you've achieved is just amazing. Questions? Yes, sir.
I was interested in the second topic you discussed as a possible issue that your team is going to come up against, the idea of there not being enough diversity in the genetics. And that's certainly intriguing to me, and certainly I can understand that being a concern. I'm also, as a social epidemiologist, interested in the flip side of that, which is how is this type of science going to be used? And I was wondering how your team is addressing this issue or grappling with it in making sure that like this type of science and research and phenotypic clinical research in general isn't used as a race-based science, isn't used as a way of essentially predicting diseases across different social categories or social races. I mean, I think even thinking about the history of Harvard it's only several decades ago where Harvard was complicit and an anchor in movements of trying to predict health outcomes, particularly the eugenics movement. So, I mean, how is your team grappling with this?
Well, first of all, that's a subject that it's close to my heart as an Israeli and a Jewish person. With a lot of family that was killed in the Holocaust. So, of course, that's something that we're thinking of. We, as a startup company, can point out the flaws, right, and the problems that could be caused by abuse of technology. But I think that that's something that is shared with any technology. Technology is never invented to be abused, but it could always be abused at the wrong hands. One of the things that we're publicly calling out to policymakers, to lawmakers, is you should look at phenotypic information the way you look at genotypic information, right? There are laws against discrimination in the US based on genomic data. We've just shown you that phenotypic data could be as accurate in classifying or predicting or inferring medical conditions, but it could be obtained much easier. A payer can go on Facebook and get your facial photo and theoretically use this technology to make predictions, to discriminate with premiums. So this is really a legislative act that should be done. At the same time, we have our own policies and we uphold to a higher standard, not just because it's the right thing to do, but we have a covenant with the network of clinicians that we work with. If we misbehave, if we abuse the technology, they will stop that virtuous cycle. They will cut it off, and we will stop getting more data. And it's against our interest to do that, right? I hope I answered your question.
Another question? Yes.
So then, how is technology used exactly like in the physician's office? Like, I saw that your CMO was taking a picture of a patient. Is it just that, or do they need to draw blood? How long does it take for a diagnosis?
So our system works in real time, but it's not a medical device. It's not a diagnostic tool. what physicians do, and it's classified as a search and reference tool. So what a physician does, and you can think about this as kind of an algorithm like Google image search, but within a proprietary database of medical conditions, right? So a physician takes a photo with their iPhone, tablet, Android-based device, a camera, and uploads it to the web, and literally within 5 seconds they get a list of disorders ranked by the similarities that we find in the phenotype. Now, many of them take this, especially in Europe, United States, where you have access to genomic data, and they share that with the lab. The lab then uses that to analyze the genomic samples that they process. But in other countries like Mexico, like Turkey, like Brazil, most of the patients and most of the physicians don't have access to genetic testing. And so they use this technology as an aid for them to make a clinical diagnosis many times.
You can see, I think, from this description what tremendous opportunities there are.
If the word challenges and opportunities are interchangeable, there are many opportunities ahead of us.
Well, Dekel, I think you've established some major barriers to entry with your massive database and your relationships and the trust relationships, as Bill said, that you have. So, yes, it's challenging, but oh my God, what are the assets? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.